In 1536, just miles from the Pacific Ocean, Captain Diego de Alcaraza, commander for New Spain, saw a naked Spaniard emerge from the forest, nearly unrecognizable, with a black man from Morocco by the name of Estevanico, and 11 Native Americans from various tribes from what today is Texas and New Mexico. He identified himself as Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca. He had been missing for 7 years and presumed dead, but according to La Relacion, his written account of events first published in Zamora, Spain in 1542, something else entirely had occurred. Historians believe that Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca was born in Spain around 1490. His grandfather was Pedro de Vera, the brutal conqueror of the Canary Islands and enslaver of the Guanche peoples. A minor nobleman with no real wealth, Pedro de Vera had sold his own sons, one of which was Cabeza de Vaca's father, Francisco de Vera, into several years of indenture to pay for his expedition to the Canary Islands. Cabeza de Vaca grew up on his grandfather's estate, surrounded by the melancholy singing of the Guanche slaves. His mother was Teresa Cabeza de Vaca. It was from her that he took his name. The Cabeza de Vacas were a Hidalgo family granted nobility after providing aid to the Castilian king, Alfonso VIII, during the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212 CE.
Our first ancestor was a shepherd. And during this time in Andalusia, there were many, if you've ever been to Sevilla, it's very, very Moorish. It's all Arabic doors and all this beautiful artistry. And at this time, the Moors and actually the Arab nations in general were just highly sophisticated in mathematics and in science. And so they had an eye on Spain. And of course, Andalusia, you can take a ferry directly across to Morocco. And so there were Moorish incursions all the time. Now, the kings of Spain were just a lot of different regional kings, but they did work together, particularly when they're supposed to be pushing out these Moors. Our ancestor, who is nameless, right? And in being nameless, had no ability to own land or have his children go to the military. But he was a shepherd. And during these incursions, nobody really cared about the shepherds, right? They were just working men traveling around and moving different animals around for grazing. And so as one of these Moorish incursions happened, supposedly our ancestor created a code. The head of the cow was the main symbol. If they find a code with directions and the head of the cow was there, they would know where the camps were and they would understand the danger. So when the incursion was over, they didn't give him money, they didn't give him anything, but what they did give him was the name, Cabeza de Vaca.
This family story was likely even more impactful to Alvar Nunez in the 16th century than it is to his ancestors today. After the death of his parents in about 1506 and 1509, Cabeza de Vaca married and made a name for himself by fighting first in the Italian wars and then in the revolt of the Comuneros. It was because of this service that he was brought to the Spanish court of Charles I of Spain, where he was appointed treasurer on the Narvaez Expedition of 1527. According to his writings, the expedition was cursed and badly mismanaged. The crew had met with storm after storm in their voyage to reach and settle Florida for the Spanish king. After being abandoned by the expedition's captain, Cabeza de Vaca and the other survivors on his ship would find themselves shipwrecked without resources for repair on an island near what is today Galveston, Texas.
¿Y de eso? ¿Qué me sugieres?
Que me tiréis un cabo para unir estas balsas.
A partir de ahora, que cada uno haga lo que mejor le parezca para salvar la propia vida.
Considerad a los de esta barca. Están enfermos y exhaustos. Dadme siquiera algunos remeros.
Así que ya lo sabéis, don Alvar. Cada uno para el santo que lo cuida y no hay más autoridad. ¡Aquí se acabó España! ¡Buena navegación!
By the time that they reached the Pacific Ocean 7 years later, he, Estevanico, and 2 other Spaniards were all that remained of the survivors. Some had been swept out to sea, some had been killed due to treacherous dealings with natives, and some had frozen or starved to death. In 2 separate cases, Cabeza de Vaca came across survivors who had resorted to cannibalism. Cabeza de Vaca found a different means of survival: collaboration. His relationships with indigenous peoples and the skills that they taught him allowed him to survive in North America and to travel all the way from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific.
We never really learned about Cabeza de Vaca, but I was told recently by a friend of mine who's a Texan through and through that they do an immense amount of study of Cabeza de Vaca because he was the first European to actually explore a ton of the areas.
Cabeza de Vaca spent time with dozens of different tribes, sometimes as a captive, sometimes as a guest, and after rejoining Spanish society in Mexico City, he created a written account of his time with indigenous peoples for the King of Spain, Charles I. He begged him to consider conquering not with the sword, but with gentleness and kindness, and argued that the indigenous peoples were advanced and should be treated as human beings and not savages. In this way, he entered the annals of Eurocentric history, cast into a European fantasy of savior and savage. Children's books and newspapers gave him a legendary status as a great explorer of sorts, who led the natives and taught them and saw the good in them. It's a very Eurocentric patriarchal view, and it's remained largely unchanged for almost 500 years.
I've heard that he was a spiritual leader and a healer.
We're very faith-based, which Cabeza de Vaca was. You know, he went on a mission.
One problem with this savior-savage narrative is that it casts Cabeza de Vaca as the savior and the Karankawa peoples as the savages. But what if that's not how the story really went? La Relacion suggests that the Karankawa are actually the decisive agents in this scenario, interacting with Cabeza de Vaca on their own terms. They chose to save the Spanish survivors by rendering emergency care. According to their norms of hospitality and diplomacy, the Karankawa women housed and fed him, and by extending hospitality into proto-adoptive activity, the Karankawa taught him skills needed to survive in North America. He was able to benefit from being allowed to choose his own work, even though it may have crossed gender for someone with a binary sensibility, and he was taught skills and perspectives that changed him for the better. I want to make the case that the journey Cabeza de Vaca undertook in 1527 was more than just a logistical one. From the moment the Spanish survivors washed up in the New World, they relied on the indigenous people for salvation.
Los indios, de ver el desastre que nos había venido y el desastre en que estábamos, con tanta desaventura y miseria, se sentaron entre nosotros, y con el gran dolor y lástima que hubieron de vernos en tanta fortuna, comenzaron todos a llorar recio, y tan de verdad que lejos de allí se podía oír, y esto les duró más de media hora. Y cierto ver que estos hombres tan sin razón y tan crudos, a manera de brutos, se dolían tanto de nosotros, hizo que en mí y en otros de la compañía creciese más la pasión y la consideración de nuestra desdicha.
La Relacion details how Cabeza de Vaca was protected, fed, and housed for the winter with what today is believed by many, including the Texas State Historical Association, to have been a branch of the Karankawa tribe. He wrote that they called themselves the Capoque people. He and the other Spaniards from the expedition were received by the Capoque as guests. The Capoque peoples, mostly women, taught him how to feed himself by showing him the ways of seasonal fruit gathering and how to dig up edible roots. In other words, he received what we might today consider a gendered education in survival from the indigenous people.
We have very good evidence, for example, in Philadelphia in the 18th century, very young children, particularly young girls, being bound out because gendered labor was so important to the functioning of any household. So again, food provision, cleaning, childcare, these were essential workers of their day. And so the idea of choice is just not as pertinent as we think of it in the modern period, but certainly as an expression of identity, particularly an identity of being a good Christian who is obedient to God and God's representative on earth, who is the male head of the household you were part of. Insofar as that's an identity, not necessarily chosen, but expected, certainly work was one of the main ways to express proper gender identity, for sure.
Anything that sort of is like important to keep people going, you know, is like vital for the caring of people, but not necessarily markable. Like cooking, teaching, caring for, things that don't leave a trophy you can be proud of metaphorically afterwards, but things that are integral to society are jobs that are designated for women.
I think the 16th and to some extent 17th century, particularly in the colonial setting of the Americas, I think of any setting, keeping an eye out for gender flexibility is very important in socialization of children and also in the general colonial project. And the reason there is that most colonial encounters between Europeans and indigenous peoples and Africans were highly sex imbalanced. So it's mostly men coming from Europe. It is mostly men from Africa who are captive and enforced into slavery. And they're coming, so two very heavily male populations are encountering indigenous populations, presumably initially at contact, which are more gender balanced. So there is immediately on the colonial frontier a shortage of women and some pressure, particularly on low status or indentured or enslaved men to perform female labor or feminized labor. It's not celebratory or choice. It's not about the gender flexibility that I think obtains in the 17th and 18th century in the colonial context is not celebrated as choice or variety or expressiveness, but it is a life or death kind of extraction of essential labor from subordinated groups who may or may not, absorb that labor as part of their identity, right? As I was arguing a second ago, because still it was a context in which the work you did and the clothes that you wore, which were of course tightly linked, largely defined your social identity and your social standing. So being forced to wear certain kinds of clothes, I would think in particular shoes, like a lack of shoes, would be a huge indicator of what kind of work you were expected to do, where you were expected to be with shoes or, without shoes. These shoes are huge.
Las mujeres son muy trabajadas, y por mucho, porque de 24 horas que hay entre día y noche, no tiene sino 6 horas de descanso, y todo lo más de la noche pasan en atizar sus hornos para secar aquellas raíces que comen. Y desde que amanece, comienzan a cavar y a traer leña y agua a sus casas y dar orden en las otras cosas de que tienen necesidad.
Cabeza de Vaca's written account makes clear that the Spaniards, intentionally and unintentionally, brought devastation to the native peoples they encountered. Their first winter with the Capoque resulted in over half of the tribe dying from a disease of the stomach that they felt certain the Spaniards had brought. This was compounded by a Capoque observance for the dead which barred the family of the dead from gathering food for 3 months. They would normally be sustained by the excess of their neighbors, but in a winter of death after death, there were very few Capoque left to gather. Cabeza de Vaca wrote that such was their honor in this observance that they would rather starve than violate their observance of the dead. Unknown to them at the time, 5 survivors of the expedition had washed up on a different side of the island. They ate each other to the last man. They did not bury any of the remains. When the Capoque found the sole survivor, they were so disturbed by this behavior that the Spaniards with them were reduced in status from guest to slave. After a long winter filled with illness, starvation, and death for both the Spaniards and the Capoque tribe taught Cabeza de Vaca and another Spaniard their method of healing, using hand movements and breath and stone, and he was asked to serve in the role of healer to contribute. Cabeza de Vaca was reluctant, having no experience in healing. He wrote that seeing their obstinance, an Indian told him that he did not know what he said by claiming that what they knew was useless, because stones and things growing out in the field have their virtues. They adapted the methods they were taught to include a sign of the cross, recitation of a Pater Noster and Ave Maria, and a prayer to God to give them good health.
He was a great healer, which doesn't surprise me because throughout the generations on our Spanish side, we were great healers. Every generation, there was a woman healer.
He was surprised to find that the healing methods he learned worked, writing that the Capoque cauterized with fire, thinking it very effective, and so did he. Modern Christian historiography, such as the Catholic Answers Encyclopedia, claim that Cabeza de Vaca's healing method was a thing from within his own knowledge, separate from indigenous peoples, but that is, by his own words, actually an indigenous practice taught to him as a way to provide him with an occupation. As the winter drug on, tension grew between the Capoque and the Spanish Christians. The Spanish, responsible already for much native suffering, offended part of the tribe when several captives assigned to be homed with one host brazenly decided to move into the home of another family. What occurs in their home is beyond Cabeza de Vaca's first-hand knowledge, but the actions result in the execution of the Spaniards involved. Their behavior as both captives and guests have been appalling. Cabeza de Vaca sensed that his time with the Capoque was drawing to an end. He endeavored instead to appeal to a tribe of peoples living on the mainland to accept him into their tribe as a slave. He called them the Chorruco and said they named themselves after the woods they lived in. Cabeza de Vaca wrote that of all the people in the world, the Chorruco loved their children the most. The Chorruco had an arguably advanced method for treating captives. They did not cage them. On the contrary, while serving as a trader, Cabeza de Vaca was permitted to contribute to the tribe by traveling great distances and bringing back the things his people needed.
Porque yo me hice mercader, procuré de usar el oficio lo mejor que supe, y por esto ellos me daban de comer y me hacían buen tratamiento, y rogábanme que me fuese de unas partes a otras por cosas que ellos habían menester. Y este oficio me estaba a mí bien, porque andando en él tenía libertad para ir donde quería, y no era obligado a cosa alguna, y no era esclavo, y donde quiera que iba me hacían buen tratamiento y me daban de comer por respeto de mis mercaderías.
In the 2012 article, Subverting Gender Roles in the 16th Century, Cabeza de Vaca, the conquistador who became a Native American woman, feminist scholar M. Carmen Gomez Galisteo reframes the context of Cabeza de Vaca's 6 years in the role of trader for the Chorruco through the lens of gender. She argues that Cabeza de Vaca was capitalizing on an opportunity to transition from a strict binary gender structure to the more flexible gender structure of the Chorruco tribe. Trading, she argues, was often a female occupation in indigenous pre-European North America. What's more, it's clear from his own writings that Cabeza de Vaca knew it.
Y así enviaron 2 mujeres, una suya y otro que de ellos tenían cautiva. Y enviaron estas porque las mujeres pueden contratar aunque haya guerra. Y nosotros las seguimos. Y paramos en un lugar donde estaba concertado que las esperaremos. Mas ellas tardaron 5 días. Y los indios decían que no debían de hallar gente.
In a binary gender structure, binary meaning 2, zeros and ones, girls and boys, you have 2 roles that things can be assigned, A or B, one or the other. So in a binary gender structure, there is only room for 2 genders, the male gender and the female gender. And they often, in a binary gender structure, become inherently correlated and borderline inseparable from sex, which, is not the way that humans always come out, even if, a certain majority of the time they do. A certain majority of the time people have brown eyes, a certain majority of the time people have brown hair, but we don't disregard blonde hair, blue-eyed individuals as non-existent or as lesser than flukes of nature. And when we examine a flexible gender structure, one where you're fully allowed to identify as something more than just the defaults, or the pre-assumed defaults, I should say, because there really is no default. We all are a little different. Even one person who identifies as a cisgendered male is going to be more manly, displaying more masculine traits than another cisgendered male. And even within the binary gender structure that we've, been socialized in, there's inescapable variance. And when you have a system that allows for variation, that doesn't need delineation between and separation between identities, but where you can fall on a vast, array of different locations on the spectrum, we see people, living closer to who they are rather than who they're expected to be. We see individuals at their finest when they are allowed to be whatever they are and not what they're made to be.
All of a sudden, he's naked, barefooted, he's vulnerable, he is transparent, and he can be who he wants to be.
He remained with the Chorruco for about 6 years and finally reunited with 3 other survivors from the expedition, and together They sought to reconnect with Spanish Christians.
He was captured by a Floridian tribe of Indians. And then I do think he was captured a second time by somebody else in the Southwest. I don't remember, but it seems to me that I recall that he was captured a couple of times. He seemed to be getting good at establishing his place with native peoples. By the time he met other Indian tribes, he understood how to wow them.
Cabeza de Vaca wrote that the indigenous peoples that he and his 3 fellow survivors encountered on their journey to find other Christians understood the Spanish custom to be this: that when the Spanish arrived at a new village, the people must give them and their escorts everything they own. The new village must then escort the Spanish to the next village, where they might recoup their losses as escorts. In this way, tribe by tribe, the survivors crossed what is today the southern United States. The party of survivors seemed to be treated according to perceived roles by indigenous people. For example, Cabeza de Vaca writes of several gifts presented to them, but never to him directly, almost always to Andres Dorantes, presumably perceived as the masculine figure or leader of the group. Estevanico, the Moroccan, took the role of negotiator or translator, a mouthpiece for the group and often a scout. Cabeza de Vaca has a perceived role that is arguably more feminine. He wrote that the babies were brought to him to kiss and cross, and on one occasion he split from the group to look after a child he feels is being punished too harshly for crying in his presence. This is, perhaps, not the standard narrative voice of a 16th century conquistador.
When talking about the history of de Vaca and his life with my mom, sort of the manner of which he kept his journal and the jobs within the tribe that he did and talked about love doing, and the way that adjusting to regular society in pretty much every way other than gender was detailed and described, I think probably it makes a lot of sense that the understanding of gender that Native cultures had was one that was more accepting and expanded upon, more enlightened than that the Europeans came with.
During their travels, Cabeza de Vaca wrote of encountering a revered gender-diverse healer who performed surgery.
Y luego aquel hombre entraba y tomaba al que quería de ellos, y dábales 3 cuchilladas grandes por las ijadas con un pedernal muy agudo, tan ancho como una mano y 2 palmos en luengo, y sacábales las tripas, y que cortaba de una tripa poco más o menos de un palmo, y aquello que cortaba echaba en las brasas, y luego la daba 3 cuchilladas en un brazo, y la segunda daba por la sangradura y desconcertábaselo, y dende a poco se lo tornaba a concertar y poníale las manos sobre las heridas, y decíanos que luego quedaban sanos, y que muchas veces cuando bailaban aparecía entre ellos, en hábito de mujer unas veces, y otras como hombre.
He would go on to perform a surgery of his own, removing an arrow from the breastbone of an elderly indigenous man. In his 1995 article, Cabeza de Vaca, the first Texas surgeon, Jesse E. Thompson credits Cabeza de Vaca with performing the first surgery in the state of Texas. This is done in clear disregard of the primary source, Cabeza de Vaca's own writings, which clearly testify to the surgeries performed by the gender-diverse medicine man. It is as if history would not recognize an achievement until accomplished by a white man. The native presence is again eclipsed by claims of white greatness. Cabeza de Vaca is made an unwilling accomplice to native erasure over 400 years after his death. By 1536, he knew he was drawing near other Christians. His first clue came in the form of a curious necklace worn by a native man they encountered. it was made from a sword belt and a horseshoe nail. When asked where he had obtained the necklace, the native indicated that he had received it from white men who came from the direction of the sunset. They had ridden on horses and lanced their people. The next clue came in the form of a tribe of starving, traumatized people, usually farmers. This tribe was reduced to hiding in caves due to constant attacks from the Spanish Christians, who burned down their homes and took them as slaves. He persisted, but eventually had to go himself. He took with him Estevanico and 11 of his closest Native American allies. He promised when he left that he would ensure the safety of them all, the starving people he had just met, and those who had traveled with him to ensure his safe passage. With these remained the other 2 Spaniards of the party, Alonso del Castillo Maldonado, a native of Salamanca, and Andres Dorantes, born at Beja. So it was that in 1536, just miles from the Pacific Ocean, Captain Diego de Alcaraza, commander for New Spain, saw this unlikely party of 13 emerge from the forest. Upon identifying himself, Cabeza de Vaca demanded that the date and an account of his statement and condition be recorded for the Spanish court.
Des Espagnols, hein? Jamais vu de ma vie d'Espagnol comme ça.
Je suis Alvarez Cabeza de Vaca, trésorier de l'expédition qui fut entreprise par le gouverneur Narvaez.
Moi, je suis Alonso del Castillo, lieutenant du roi.
Moi, Andrés Dorantes, je suis officier de la garde espagnole.
Moi, je m'appelle Estebanico Moore du Maroc et soldat espagnol.
Adventurer, healer, leader, savior, first European, first white man. Why have these facets of Cabeza de Vaca survived? Why have other facets of him been forgotten?
Alvar!
So I'm related to Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca directly through paternal connections. So if you follow through on the family tree, it hits my father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, all paternal, and it's a direct line, meaning that he's my 13th removed great-grandfather from a direct paternal line.
When talking with my mom during the process of making this, a lot of the sort of like life and history and really like true story of De Vaca was really uncovered for me. Like sort of things I'd heard was he was related to the 7 cities of gold myth as sort of like an act of trying to like protect native people, something about like a bullhead perhaps that I remember vaguely, you know, being a conquistador coming with the church to convert people.
I was a child and I had learned about him in school in about the 4th grade. And we were learning about explorers, great explorers. We learned about Christopher Columbus, Cortez, Cabeza de Vaca. And I was curious because my grandmother's maiden name was Vaca. And so it kind of struck a little spark. And I started to research it. My first research project was that the name Vaca, they dropped the V and they made it Vaca.
Cabeza de Vaca I had an interest in and would often try to seek him out, from information sources, but it was really hard to find anything, being a child of the 80s. So my information sources were pretty limited, things in the library. A lot of times I would look him up, in history books when I was at school, or just try to use the card catalog if I was in a library. And sometimes I would find things about him, but they were really just like 1 or 2 sentences long. except for I happened to watch, it was a special on TV in the very early 90s talking about early American explorers, and they did a pretty, at least for him, a pretty in-depth blurb about him, discussing some of the things he did, and that was probably where I found the most out about him that wasn't, verbally spoken about through our family.
This was the first European explorer to go to Florida, and then he got lost. He was captured by Indians, and they sort of took him in. Also, he understood a little bit of the more modern medicine at the time, so they kind of made him a medicine man, and it allowed him to escape. Now, he originally got there because he was going to explore, and there was a shipwreck. And with the shipwreck, I think there was some guys that perished, and then a few remained.
There was so little history on him that I could find, but that he was an explorer, that he didn't land where he meant to land, and that he found his people eventually. The additional items were things I heard from that special or things I read. I found it especially interesting, his godliness, his faith healer aspect of it, because we've had a family line of people who are very godly and are faith healers. So I found it interesting that it carried back that far back.
I didn't know he was not in a power position the majority, if any, of the time he was in the Americas, and only through related violence and abuse of these people who by and large didn't have a lesser understanding but a different understanding of the way of the world. Was he even returned to his home or gone back to the life he lived before, which in his journaling he had a hard time readjusting to. It's not hard to readjust to a life of comfort after you've been camping. There has to be something that you truly miss for you to return back to your roots, what you come from, and not feel comfortable anymore.
I found out later that he went back to Spain, and because it didn't make sense to me that he went back to Spain, because I don't know if it's his children or his children's children ended up returning and coming back to New Mexico to fight the Pueblo Indians. So I kind of assumed he stayed in Mexico City, and I learned later that he went back to Andalusia and wrote a book about his adventures and kind of solidified himself as a public figure.
I think after he got broken and he found his freedom, I think that going back to where he had to go back to must have been his own prison, his own hell.
I had not heard or known that Cabeza de Vaca was genderqueer, and it's quite surprising based on the way how religious my family is and how connected to the Catholic Church my family is. But it's not so surprising because my family's pretty open-minded.
I think it's highly likely that they probably had a more nuanced and a non-cisgendered identity than we'll ever fully be able to know. I think that secret is one that probably went with them to their grave.
My family's very heavily Catholic, so, I think gender expectations were pretty assumed based on your Catholic beliefs.
When discussing his life and legacy, especially within family as descendants, but just in general, historians, coming from the same viewpoint, tend to elevate the triumphs and the good doings and the status and position and whatnots of this person, and sort of brush under the rug the less savory or more shameful aspects. And unfortunately, the culture that a lot of historians have come from is one where admitting weakness, or not weakness, but admitting a lack of understanding is viewed as a weakness, admitting that you have more to gain, or that the way you lived before was wrong. To see the world from a new perspective is something we view as lesser, and only recently in modern history have we really seen people come to the widespread conclusion that changing your mind is a positive thing. So the image we have painted of De Vaca is one of someone who came just as steadfast with his values as he left, and, you know, protected these people he viewed as lesser before returning to his home, when this is not what happened. It literally started with a shipwreck, and then, like, had his whole worldview destroyed and rebuilt anew, only to have to fit that expansion back into the box that he came from. Which, like, that's not, you know, like, it's like it's a false depiction, you know. It's a portrait of a different man.
So he goes on this mission, and he's a broken man. You know, when I read his story, I feel his pain.
We are still a very Catholic family, a very Christian family. We have a lot of pride and connection to the fact that our family came from Spain originally. We still have a lot of the beliefs and the value systems that we had when he was alive.
I lived all these years in Sweden and in Spain and all over the place. And, you know, in the old world countries, I really feel like there is, you know, people who stayed, and then all of these crazy people who went to the New World. And it's almost like maybe there's some kind of a genetic risk taking that comes into play, because, you know, I too do, you know, a lot of risky things that have high rewards. And I've thought about it, just like, maybe this is in your blood.
So Ancestry, to me, the reason why I started it is because I wanted to know where I came from. And I wanted to know if that DNA was in me still, if that's why I have blue-green eyes, or if that is why I have a temperament, or if that is why my children are just gorgeous.
At least with Cabeza de Vaca, possibly just because he was so little known in history, that you can feel pride in the things he did, because there was never really, I never really saw anything that said he was a horrible person. The things I saw about him were either really generic and bland, or were indicative of a good person.
Having an ancestor that was genderqueer would hugely impact the way that I see myself, even more than as a logical person who would like to distance myself from tribalistic behavior would like to admit. Having someone in my bloodline that I'm descended from that's like me would make me feel like a part of the clan. As, you know, as monkey-brained as that is, it's, you know, nonetheless still ingrained, and it's, you know, hugely important.
It's not something new, and that it's not something wrong. It's something that we were just told it was wrong for a long time, so we accepted it. But, you know, we live in a world now where information is so much more free that we can understand that there's all sorts of shades to the rainbow. You know, it's not black and white.
It's very powerful to include and make room for ambiguity, transgression, surprises in the past, because it humanizes the past. And it, I think, is comforting to, you know, to learners, to people in the educational environment, including myself, that we may not have it all figured out in the present. And in fact, that is the human condition. And so when we encounter souls in struggle or souls who are behaving in transgressive or creative or rebellious ways. It just humanizes that hunger that we have for connection, for recognition, for a kind of consolation around the struggle to be who we're supposed to be on this earth and treat each other the way we ideally should treat each other. And sometimes those stories of transgression or surprise or creativity or rebellion are heartbreaking. And yet they're not always success stories, which of course is the most welcomed kind of story from the past in a U.S. context. But I nonetheless believe that they're very fortifying and humanizing, just deeply humanizing to, as much as we shouldn't necessarily project ourselves into the past, it is almost an inescapable hunger that we do so. And so responding to that hunger in a way that's, has integrity and not simply consumes the past for the present's appetites, but creates a dialogue, a kind of respectful dialogue with our ancestors, small a, right? Our predecessors from the past who managed to make themselves heard and felt, haunt us to this day.